Marcus Henderson's weathered hand froze on the kennel latch. The metal click echoed exactly like the rifle bolt from Firebase Charlie, 1969. Outside, September thunder rumbled like mortars across Texas sky. Same storm pattern as the night he'd lost Max to cancer 3 years ago. The Medicare notice in his pocket wasn't about his benefits. It was about Duke's final day. Kennel number 47 housed their longest resident. 847 days of hope, dissolving into bureaucratic arithmetic. Tomorrow would be day 848. It would also be Duke's last. The German shepherd sat motionless in the corner, intelligent brown eyes reflecting fluorescent lights like dying stars. Marcus's coffee mug trembled, same pattern as his mother's when the telegram came from Vietnam. 3 generations of men breaking coffee cups over news that broke hearts. The grandfather clock in the office ticked louder than his failing resolve. Why did every goodbye feel like abandoning a foxhole? Tonight's forecast: severe emotional weather warning. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Marcus Henderson had seen enough broken souls in his 67 years to recognize one staring back from kennel number 47. Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd, carried himself with the careful dignity of a soldier who'd learned that sudden movements brought pain. The notched ear and slight limp told stories Marcus understood without words, badges of survival that marked both man and beast who'd served their time in hell. The Austin County Animal Shelter had become Marcus's second war zone after Vietnam, where battles were fought with clipboards instead of rifles, and casualties were measured in euthanasia statistics rather than body counts. For 15 years, he'd been the last line of defense for animals society had written off. Duke reminded him of Max, his own German shepherd, who'd pulled him through the dark years after Sarah's death. When cancer finally claimed Max 3 years ago, Marcus thought his heart had calcified beyond repair. Doctor. Patricia Williams rounded the corner, her sensible shoes squeaking against the polished concrete. At 52, she possessed the rare combination of clinical pragmatism and fierce compassion that made her both the county's most effective veterinarian and Marcus's most trusted ally. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in the same efficient ponytail she'd worn since medical school, and her green eyes held the weight of 1,000 impossible decisions. "Morning, Marcus," she said, checking her tablet. "Commissioner Phillips called. They want the population numbers by noon." Marcus's jaw tightened. The mathematics of mercy had become increasingly brutal as budget cuts strangled resources. 150 kennels housing 180 animals meant 30 stories would end badly. Duke's size and age made him mathematically inevitable. Too big for apartment dwellers, too old for families wanting puppies, too German shepherd for a post-9/11 world that still flinched at certain breeds. The shelter reflected the harsh realities of rural Texas pragmatism. Built in 1987 with federal grants that had long since expired, it served 3 counties with a skeleton crew of 5 full-time employees and a rotating cast of volunteers whose good intentions couldn't overcome systemic underfunding. Local politics treated animal welfare as a luxury expense, always first on the chopping block when budgets tightened. Bobby Martinez's surrender paperwork from 2 years ago told a familiar story. Military service, PTSD, relationship with alcohol that ended in violence. The difference was Bobby's honesty. "I can't be the man this dog deserves. He needs someone who won't hurt him when the darkness comes." That kind of self-awareness was rare enough to earn Marcus's grudging respect, even as he cursed the system that failed both veteran and animal. Duke had arrived broken but not bitter, carrying trauma like an old wound that ached before storms. His intelligence remained sharp. Marcus had watched him learn the shelter routines, memorize staff schedules, and somehow understand that Fridays meant adoptions and Mondays meant returns. The big dog had adapted to kennel life with military precision, but his eyes still searched every face for the person who might finally mean forever. In 17 hours, that search would end. The morning of day 845 began like any other until Commissioner Janet Phillips stepped through the shelter's front door at precisely 9:15 a.m., her heels clicking against the linoleum with the rhythm of a countdown timer. Marcus knew that walk. He'd heard it from bureaucrats in Saigon who came to deliver body counts and budget cuts with equal efficiency. "Henderson, we need to talk." Phillips didn't waste time with pleasantries. At 55, she possessed the kind of political armor that deflected emotion like rain off a tin roof. Her navy suit and perfectly styled blonde hair suggested someone who'd never had animal fur on her clothing or mud under her manicured nails. Marcus wiped his hands on his work shirt, leaving streaks of kennel cleaner and something darker, the residue of dreams deferred. "What can I do for you, Commissioner?" 72 hours, Marcus. "I need 30 animals off your census by Friday afternoon." She consulted her tablet with the detachment of someone reading a grocery list. "The state inspector arrives Monday and we cannot be over capacity." The words hit Marcus like shrapnel, sharp, unexpected, designed to inflict maximum damage with surgical precision. 30 animals? In 3 days? That's impossible. Nothing's impossible when your funding depends on compliance. Phillips's smile held all the warmth of winter morning. "I've run the numbers. You have 15 animals over age 7, 12 with behavioral issues, and 23 large breeds. The math works itself out." Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway, having overheard enough to understand the gravity. Her medical bag hung from her shoulder like a lifeline, packed with tools to save lives now being commandeered for the opposite purpose. "Commissioner, some of these animals just need time." "Duke, for instance. The German Shepherd in 47? Phillips flipped through her notes. 845 days. "That's not time, doctor. That's denial." Marcus felt something break inside his chest, a sound like stepping on old bones. "Duke's not a number. He's a living being who deserves—" "What he deserves and what we can afford are two different conversations." Phillips' voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "I'm not the villain here, Marcus. I'm trying to save this place. We're hemorrhaging money on animals nobody wants while adoptable pets get euthanized in Houston and Dallas because they don't have space." The logic was brutal and undeniable. Marcus had seen the statistics: younger, smaller, prettier animals dying in overcrowded city shelters, while Duke occupied kennel space that could house 3 beagles or 5 cats. But logic felt like betrayal when it came wearing a suit and demanding sacrifice from those who couldn't negotiate their own terms. "Give me the weekend," Marcus said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man calling in his last favor. "Let me make calls. There are rescue organizations, transport groups." 72 hours, Phillips repeated, checking her watch. "Not 73. The state inspection determines our funding for the next fiscal year. Fail that inspection, and we close permanently. Then every animal here dies." After Phillips left, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and political ambition, Marcus walked the kennel rows with the measured pace of a man surveying a battlefield. Each occupied cage represented a story truncated, a life interrupted by human failure. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 15 years as their protector, and now he'd become their executioner. Duke watched from kennel number 47 with the patient attention of someone who'd learned to read human faces for survival cues. His tail offered a tentative wag when Marcus approached, a gesture so hopeful it felt like accusation. How do you explain to a creature who trusts absolutely that trust isn't enough? "Hey, big guy," Marcus whispered, kneeling beside the kennel door. Duke pressed against the chain link, seeking contact through the barrier that defined their relationship. "I promised I wouldn't give up on you." The weight of that promise settled on Marcus's shoulders like a rucksack filled with stones. In Vietnam, impossible promises had been currency. Everyone swore they'd bring everyone home, knowing mathematics made liars of them all. But this felt different. Duke hadn't volunteered for this war. Dr. Williams found him there 20 minutes later, still kneeling, still whispering apologies Duke couldn't understand. "We could start with the medical cases," she said quietly. "The ones suffering anyway." Marcus shook his head. "Duke's healthy. Perfect blood work last month. Strong heart, clear eyes. He could live another 8 years with the right family. Then we find him that family in 72 hours?" The silence stretched between them like a bridge built from hope and spanning an impossible distance. Outside, September thunder promised rain, and Marcus remembered another storm, another countdown, another moment when good intentions collided with immutable deadlines. Duke's brown eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like stars in a dark sky, still believing in tomorrow. Day 846 arrived with the weight of inevitability, and Marcus Henderson found himself staring at a sheet of paper that reduced lives to checkboxes. The euthanasia list sat on his desk like an indictment, 30 names typed in clinical Helvetica font that somehow made death seem administrative rather than final. Duke's name appeared at number 7 between a 14-year-old beagle with kidney disease and a pit bull mix, whose only crime was being born into a world that feared his breed. The morning staff meeting convened in the break room, where faded motivational posters about making a difference watched over proceedings with bitter irony. Dr. Williams spread the paperwork across the scarred Formica table, while 3 shelter technicians, Jenny, Carlos, and Tom, sat with the hollow-eyed expression of soldiers receiving impossible orders. "I won't sign it," Marcus said before anyone could speak. His voice carried the steady calm of a man who'd made peace with insubordination. "Not Duke, not today." Jenny Rodriguez, barely 25 but already hardened by 2 years of shelter work, looked up from the list. "Marcus, you know I love Duke, but Commissioner Phillips was clear. If we don't—" "I know what she said." Marcus's weathered hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. The same ceramic mug he'd used for 15 years, chipped at the rim where countless mornings had worn away the glaze. "But some things matter more than politics." The silence that followed felt like standing in a cemetery at midnight, heavy with unspoken grief and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Carlos Martinez, no relation to Bobby despite sharing a surname that carried different kinds of burden, finally spoke. "My uncle's got a ranch outside Fredericksburg. He might take Duke." "Might isn't good enough," Dr. Williams said gently. "We need guarantees. Contracts. Home inspections." Tom Wheeler, the senior technician whose gray beard had witnessed more animal deaths than a battlefield medic, cleared his throat. "What about that guy who used to own him? Bobby Martinez, maybe he—" "No." Marcus's response came fast and sharp as a rifle crack. "Bobby surrendered him for good reasons. PTSD, drinking problem, history of violence. Duke's better off dead than back in that situation." But even as he spoke the words, Marcus felt doubt gnawing at his certainty like termites in old wood. Was death really preferable to an imperfect home? The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, visible but untouchable. At 11:30 a.m., as if summoned by their conversation, Bobby Martinez appeared in the shelter lobby. 2 years had carved new lines around his eyes, but sobriety had straightened his shoulders and steadied his hands. He wore a clean flannel shirt and work boots that had seen honest labor rather than barroom floors. "I'd like to see Duke," he said simply, meeting Marcus's hostile stare without flinching. "Not to take him, just to see him." Marcus wanted to refuse, to protect Duke from reopening old wounds, but something in Bobby's voice, a quality of exhaustion that suggested long battles fought in private, made him reconsider. They walked to kennel number 47 in silence, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls that had absorbed decades of desperate barking and quiet whimpers. Duke's reaction was immediate and devastating. The big dog pressed himself against the far wall, tail tucked, eyes wide with recognition and remembered fear. His whole body seemed to shrink, the confident animal Marcus knew disappearing into something small and broken. "Jesus," Bobby whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. "Look what I did to him." "You did the right thing bringing him here," Marcus said, surprising himself with the absence of anger in his voice. "That took courage." Bobby's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone who'd stared into his own abyss and found it wanting. "Courage! I beat a dog who loved me because he reminded me of Rex, because he wasn't aggressive enough, because he was gentle, and I thought that made him weak." He paused, watching Duke's trembling form. "Rex died because I couldn't save him. Duke almost died because I couldn't save myself." The confession hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Marcus had heard variations of this story countless times. Good people broken by circumstances beyond their control, making terrible choices that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. "He's on the list," Marcus said quietly. "Euthanasia scheduled for tomorrow afternoon." Bobby's face went pale beneath his tan. No, that's not. I'll take him back. I'm sober now. 8 months clean." "I've got a job, an apartment. And what happens when you have a bad day? When the nightmares come back?" Marcus's voice carried the weight of experience with broken promises and good intentions. "Duke can't survive another betrayal." "Then what? You just let him die because I fucked up?" Bobby's composure cracked, revealing the raw grief underneath. "He's 6 years old, Marcus. He could have another decade with the right family." "The right family doesn't exist." The words tasted like ashes in Marcus's mouth. "We've had him 846 days. 27 families have met him. All of them found reasons to walk away." Bobby stared at Duke, who had begun to inch closer to the front of the kennel, drawn by familiar voices despite his fear. "What if I found him a home? What if I could guarantee—" "With what? Money? You barely keep yourself afloat." "I've got money." Bobby's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Settlement from the department. Disability pension. Enough to pay for his care for the rest of his life with the right family." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, like tectonic plates realigning after an earthquake. Hope was dangerous in this business. It led to poor decisions and broken hearts. But it was also the only thing that made the work bearable. 48 hours, he said finally. "Find him a family in 48 hours, and I'll fight Commissioner Phillips myself." Outside, September thunder promised another storm, but for the first time in days, it sounded less like a threat than a promise. Day 847 dawned with the peculiar clarity that comes before storms, both meteorological and metaphorical. Marcus arrived at the shelter before sunrise, his headlights cutting through the Texas darkness as he navigated the familiar gravel road that led to what might be Duke's final day. The parking lot stretched empty except for his truck, and the silence felt oppressive, like standing in a church during a funeral. Nobody attended. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed their eternal dirge while Marcus performed the morning rituals that had sustained him through 15 years of impossible decisions. Coffee first, strong enough to wake the dead and bitter enough to match his mood. Then the kennel walks, checking water bowls and food dispensers while cataloging the overnight casualties. 3 dogs had stopped eating, a sure sign they'd given up hope, and 2 cats had developed upper respiratory infections that would complicate their already slim adoption prospects. Duke waited in kennel number 47 with the patient dignity of a soldier on death row. His water bowl sat empty despite being filled the night before. Stress had a way of making even the most basic needs feel impossible. When Marcus approached, the big dog's tail offered a tentative wag that felt like forgiveness for sins not yet committed. "Morning, big guy," Marcus whispered, kneeling beside the chain-link barrier that had defined their relationship for 847 days. "Bobby's working on something. Don't give up on us yet." At 7:30 a.m., the local news van pulled into the parking lot, followed by a second vehicle Marcus didn't recognize, a silver sedan with Austin plates that moved with the purposeful efficiency of people on a mission. The convergence felt ominous, like watching storm clouds gather on a clear horizon. Jennifer Walsh from KXAN News emerged from the van with her cameraman in tow, her perfectly styled blonde hair and media-friendly smile suggesting someone who'd never had to choose between groceries and veterinary bills. She'd called the night before, having somehow learned about Duke's story through the mysterious networks that turned local tragedies into viral content. "Mr. Henderson?" she called, approaching with the confident stride of someone accustomed to doors opening at her approach. "We spoke yesterday about the German Shepherd. Our viewers are very interested in this story." Marcus nodded, though interest felt like a poor substitute for action. Media attention was a double-edged sword in animal rescue. It could generate adoptions and donations, but it could also create pressure that led to hasty decisions and unsuitable placements. Duke deserved better than becoming a feel-good segment between weather and sports. The interview took place in front of kennel number 47, with Duke providing a photogenic backdrop of quiet dignity and barely contained hope. Marcus found himself speaking words he'd rehearsed in his head but never expected to say aloud. Duke represents everything noble about his breed. Loyal, intelligent, protective. He's been failed by a system that treats animals like inventory rather than individuals. As the cameras rolled, Marcus noticed movement near the front entrance. A middle-aged couple stood just inside the lobby, watching the proceedings with the careful attention of people who understood the weight of media coverage. The woman had silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who worked with them daily. The man beside her carried himself with the straight-backed posture of military service, though civilian clothes couldn't quite disguise the bearing that never truly left veterans. During a break in filming, the couple approached with the measured steps of people who'd rehearsed this moment countless times in private. The woman spoke first, her voice carrying the soft authority of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. "Mr. Henderson, I'm Linda Thompson. This is my husband John. We've been following Duke's story for quite some time." Marcus felt his skepticism reflexively engage. Media coverage always brought out the curious and the well-intentioned, but Duke needed more than sympathy. He needed a lifetime commitment from people who understood the responsibility they were accepting. "Following his story?" Marcus asked, studying their faces for signs of the casual interest that characterized most shelter visitors. John Thompson stepped forward, and Marcus recognized something familiar in his bearing. The careful control of someone who'd learned to manage trauma through discipline and routine. "Our son Michael was a K-9 officer with the Austin Police Department. He was killed in the line of duty 3 years ago, along with his partner, a German Shepherd named Rex." The revelation hit Marcus like cold water. He'd read about Officer Michael Thompson's death, a routine traffic stop that escalated into violence, ending with both human and canine partners dying in service to a community that would remember them with monuments and moments of silence but little practical action. "We've been watching Duke through your social media posts," Linda continued, her voice steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "We know about his history with Bobby Martinez. We know about the PTSD, the trauma, the challenges he faces. We've been waiting until we felt ready." Marcus felt something shift in his chest, not hope exactly, but a loosening of the knot of despair that had tightened with each passing day. "Ready for what?" "To honor our son's memory by giving another police dog the home he deserves," John said simply. "Michael always said that dogs like Rex and Duke don't retire. They just change their mission." The words carried weight that went beyond sentiment. Marcus had seen too many adoptions motivated by emotion rather than commitment, resulting in returns and rehomings that compounded trauma rather than healing it. But something in the Thompsons' demeanor suggested people who understood the difference between wanting to help and being prepared to help. "Duke has issues," Marcus said carefully, testing their resolve. "He's been traumatized. He may never fully trust men. He'll need patience, consistency, possibly professional training. This isn't a feel-good story. It's a commitment that could last 10 years. Linda smiled, and Marcus saw grief and determination warring in her expression. "Mr. Henderson, we've spent 3 years learning to live with the hole our son's death left in our hearts. We're not looking for a replacement or a quick fix. We're looking for a way to transform our grief into purpose." As if sensing the conversation's significance, Duke had moved to the front of his kennel, pressing against the chain link with the desperate hope of someone who'd learned not to expect miracles but couldn't quite abandon the possibility. His brown eyes moved between the Thompsons and Marcus, reading human emotions with the accuracy that had made his breed invaluable to law enforcement for generations. "Can we meet him?" John asked, his voice carrying the same careful control Marcus recognized in his own speech when discussing difficult cases. The introduction took place in the shelter's meet-and-greet room, a sterile space designed to facilitate connections between animals and potential families. Duke entered with his characteristic wariness, immediately positioning himself behind Marcus while keeping his eyes fixed on John, the male presence that triggered his deepest trauma responses. For 20 minutes, John remained motionless, while Linda spoke in low, soothing tones about everything except adoption. She discussed the weather, her job as a retired teacher, the garden she was planning for spring. Gradually, Duke's posture relaxed, and he began to inch closer to this woman who understood that trust couldn't be demanded, only earned. When Duke finally allowed Linda to touch him, a gentle hand extended for him to sniff before making contact with his shoulder, Marcus felt tears he hadn't expected burning behind his eyes. The big dog leaned into her touch with the desperate gratitude of someone who'd almost forgotten what kindness felt like. John remained patient throughout, understanding that his acceptance would come later, if at all. His willingness to be the least important person in the room spoke volumes about his understanding of trauma and the long road of recovery. "We'd like to adopt him," Linda said simply as the visit concluded. "We understand there will be paperwork, home visits, probably a waiting period." Marcus nodded, though the timeline felt impossible. "The county wants him euthanized by 5 o'clock today. Commissioner Phillips has already signed the paperwork." The Thompsons exchanged a look that contained years of shared grief and newfound purpose. "Then we need to move quickly," John said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions under pressure. "What do we need to do?" As Marcus began explaining the adoption process, he caught sight of Bobby Martinez standing in the lobby, having witnessed the entire interaction through the glass partition. The younger man's face showed a complex mixture of relief and loss, the expression of someone watching their past find a better future while knowing they couldn't be part of it. Outside, the first drops of September rain began falling, and Marcus remembered another storm, another deadline, another moment when impossible odds collided with human determination. But for the first time in 847 days, the approaching weather sounded less like a dirge than a baptism. Duke's journey was far from over, but perhaps, finally, it was heading home. The clock on Marcus's office wall ticked with the persistence of a metronome counting down to execution, each second bringing them closer to the 5 p.m. deadline that hung over the shelter like a storm cloud pregnant with lightning. Commissioner Phillips had returned at noon, her presence filling the cramped office with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that reduced living beings to statistical problems requiring administrative solutions. "The paperwork is signed, Henderson," she said, placing the euthanasia authorization on his desk with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Dr. Williams has been notified. The procedure is scheduled for 4:30. Marcus stared at the document, his vision blurring not from age but from the weight of watching hope collide with reality. The Thompson family had completed their application with military precision, but even emergency adoptions required county approval, background checks, and home inspections that couldn't be compressed into 5 hours without creating liability issues that politicians feared more than bad publicity. "The Thompsons are perfect for Duke," Marcus said, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man calling in his last favor from an indifferent universe. "They understand his needs, his trauma. Their son died serving alongside a German shepherd." Phillips consulted her tablet with the detachment of someone reading a weather report. "Their application will be processed according to standard protocol. 72 hours for background checks, 48 hours for home inspection scheduling, another 72 hours for approval or denial. That puts us well into next week. Duke will be dead by then." "Yes, he will." Phillips's acknowledgement carried no malice, only the practical acceptance of someone who'd learned to compartmentalize conscience for the greater good. "I'm not the villain here, Marcus. The state inspection determines funding for the entire county animal services budget. Fail that inspection, and we lose federal grants that keep all of these animals alive. Sometimes sacrifice is mathematics." The logic was unassailable and morally repugnant in equal measure. Marcus had witnessed similar calculations in Vietnam, where commanders weighed the lives of individual soldiers against strategic objectives that existed only on maps drawn by people who'd never heard incoming artillery. But Duke wasn't a soldier. He was a victim of human failure who deserved better than becoming collateral damage in someone else's political war. "Doctor." Williams appeared in the doorway, her medical bag hanging from her shoulder like a burden she could never quite set down. At 52, she'd performed more euthanasias than battlefield surgeons had conducted amputations, each one a small death of the idealism that had drawn her to veterinary medicine. Her green eyes held the exhaustion of someone who'd spent years fighting a war where victory was measured in animals saved rather than problems solved. "The pentobarbital is prepared," she said quietly, her clinical training warring with the emotional attachment that made her job simultaneously possible and unbearable. "But I wanted on record that Duke is healthy, intelligent, and adoptable. This is administrative convenience, not medical necessity." Phillips' expression hardened. "Doctor, your job is medical care, not policy evaluation. The county pays your salary to provide professional services, not political commentary. My professional opinion is that this animal doesn't deserve to die today." "Deserve has nothing to do with it. Resources are finite. Kennel space is finite. Public tolerance for tax expenditures on animal welfare is finite. Duke has consumed county resources for 847 days without generating a single adoption fee or positive outcome. From an accounting perspective, he's a failed investment." Marcus felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, which had been cracked too many times to shatter completely, but his faith in systems he'd spent 15 years trying to reform from within. He's not an investment. He's a living being who's done nothing wrong except trust humans who failed him. "Sentiment doesn't balance budgets," Phillips replied, checking her watch with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to uncomfortable conversations. 4:30, Doctor." "Williams, the injection site is prepared, and I've notified the county crematorium for pickup at 6. As Phillips departed, trailing her usual scent of political ambition and expensive perfume, Marcus found himself alone with decisions that felt like choosing between his own fingers. The Thompson family waited in the lobby, their adoption application complete but meaningless, without official approval that wouldn't come in time. Bobby Martinez had returned with a cashier's check for $5,000, a desperate gesture toward financial responsibility that couldn't purchase absolution for past failures. Outside, the September storm had intensified, rain hammering against the windows with the persistence of grief that refused to be ignored. Marcus remembered another storm 30 years earlier, when Sarah had died in the hospital while he held her hand and promised impossible things about forever. Some storms brought destruction, others brought clarity that felt like drowning. And at 3:45 p.m., with 45 minutes remaining before Duke's scheduled death, Marcus made a decision that would either save one life or destroy his career. He walked to kennel number 47, where Duke waited with the patient dignity of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous, but abandoning it was death. "Come on, big guy," Marcus whispered, opening the kennel door for what might be the last time. "We're going for a ride." Duke emerged with the careful optimism of someone who'd been disappointed too many times to trust easily, but couldn't quite abandon the possibility of good news. His tail offered a tentative wag as Marcus clipped the leash to his collar. Not the slip lead used for medical procedures, but the nylon walking leash that suggested adventure rather than finality. They walked past the front desk where Jenny Rodriguez sat with tears streaming down her face, past the lobby where the Thompson family maintained their vigil with the determined patience of people who'd learned that some battles were won through endurance rather than strategy. Marcus caught Linda Thompson's eye and nodded toward the back exit, a gesture that communicated more than words could manage. The rain soaked through Marcus's uniform shirt within seconds of stepping outside, but Duke seemed energized by the weather, his nose working overtime to process the rich symphony of scents that accompanied storms. They made their way to Marcus's pickup truck, where Duke jumped into the passenger seat with the enthusiasm of someone who remembered that vehicles meant possibility. As Marcus started the engine, his cell phone rang. Dr. Williams's name appeared on the display, and he could imagine her standing in the medical room with prepared syringes and official paperwork that required his signature to transform mercy into murder. "Marcus, where are you? Commissioner Phillips is asking about the schedule." "Tell her I'm running late," Marcus said, pulling out of the parking lot with Duke pressed against the passenger window, watching the familiar landscape scroll past like a film reel of memory. "Equipment malfunction. Need to reschedule for tomorrow." "Marcus?" 24 hours, Pat. Give me 24 hours to find another solution." The line went silent except for the sound of rain against windows and dreams against reality. Dr. Williams understood the weight of impossible choices. She'd made them herself, choosing which animals to save when resources forced triage decisions that would haunt her sleep for years. "Equipment malfunction," she repeated slowly. "I'll document that in my report." "But tomorrow we'll have options we don't have today." As Marcus drove through the rain-soaked streets of Austin County, Duke beside him with his nose pressed against the glass and hope flickering in his brown eyes like candlelight in a hurricane, he realized that some promises were worth keeping, even when keeping them meant breaking everything else. The clock on the dashboard read 4:25 p.m., and somewhere behind them, Commissioner Phillips was discovering that administrative authority meant nothing when confronted by human conscience, armed with truck keys and 30 years of accumulated moral debt. The storm showed no signs of abating, but for the first time in 847 days, the rain sounded like applause. The rain had turned Marcus's gravel driveway into a treacherous maze of puddles and loose stones, but Duke navigated it with the sure-footed confidence of a dog who'd learned to find stability in unstable circumstances. Marcus's farmhouse stood weathered and welcoming against the storm, its wraparound porch offering sanctuary from the September deluge that seemed determined to wash away the sins of summer. Inside, the house carried the particular silence of someone who'd lived alone too long, not empty exactly, but holding its breath, waiting for life to return to rooms that remembered better days. Duke explored with the careful methodology of a K-9 officer conducting a security sweep, his nose cataloging scents that told stories Marcus had forgotten, Sarah's lavender perfume still lingering in the bedroom closet, Max's favorite tennis ball wedged behind the couch, the ghost of countless dinners shared with people who'd moved on or moved away. Marcus's phone rang at 5:17 p.m., exactly 47 minutes after Duke's scheduled execution. Commissioner Phillips' name appeared on the display like an accusation, and Marcus felt his stomach clench with the familiar anxiety of insubordination. He'd broken orders before, once in Vietnam when following them would have meant abandoning wounded soldiers, and again during his early days at the shelter when budget cuts demanded euthanizing healthy animals to make room for political priorities. "Henderson, where the hell are you?" Phillips's voice carried the razor-sharp edge of someone whose authority had been publicly challenged. "Dr. Williams says there was an equipment malfunction, but your truck isn't in the parking lot." Marcus watched Duke settle onto the living room rug with a contented sigh, the big dog's body finally relaxing for the first time in months. "I took him home, Commissioner." "Duke is with me." The silence that followed felt like standing on a frozen lake and hearing the ice crack beneath your feet. That moment of recognition when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. Marcus could hear Phillips breathing, calculating the political ramifications of an employee who'd chosen conscience over compliance. "You stole county property," she said finally, her voice dropping to the deadly calm that preceded legal thunderstorms. "That's a felony, Henderson. Theft of government assets. I can have the sheriff at your door within the hour." "Go ahead." Marcus surprised himself with the steadiness of his own voice. "Duke was scheduled to die at 4:30. By your own accounting, he's already dead. You can't steal something that doesn't exist. Don't play semantic games with me. Return that animal immediately, or I'll have you arrested and the dog destroyed anyway. At least if you cooperate, you might avoid jail time." Marcus looked at Duke, who had rolled onto his back in a display of trust so complete it felt like forgiveness for 30 years of accumulated failures. The big dog's belly was exposed, his legs akimbo, in the ridiculous position that German shepherds assumed when they felt completely safe. It was a sight Marcus hadn't witnessed since Duke's arrival. Vulnerability without fear, relaxation without vigilance. "No," Marcus said simply. "No. I've spent 15 years following orders that turned mercy into murder. I've signed papers that reduced living beings to statistical problems. I've watched good animals die because bureaucrats needed neat numbers for their reports." Marcus felt decades of suppressed rage bubbling up like water from a poisoned well. "Not today. Not Duke." Phillips's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter satisfaction of someone who'd finally caught an opponent in checkmate. "Enjoy your moral victory, Henderson. It's going to cost you everything, your job, your pension, probably your freedom. And for what? One dog that nobody wanted anyway? For the principle that some things matter more than politics. Principles don't pay rent or buy groceries. Reality does. And the reality is that you've just destroyed your life for an animal that will probably end up back at the shelter within a month when you realize you can't afford his care." The call ended with the finality of a door slamming, leaving Marcus alone with the sound of rain against windows and Duke's gentle snoring from the living room floor. The weight of his decision settled on his shoulders like a familiar rucksack, heavy but bearable, the burden of someone who'd chosen to carry something precious rather than letting it fall. His landline rang 15 minutes later. Jenny Rodriguez's voice came through the speaker with barely controlled panic. "Marcus, Commissioner Phillips called the sheriff's department. They're sending a deputy to your house. She wants Duke back tonight and you in custody by morning." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of consequences he'd accepted but hadn't fully calculated. Losing his job was one thing. He had savings, a pension from the Army, Social Security that would keep him fed and housed. But criminal charges would mean Duke's story ending in tragedy anyway, his sacrifice rendered meaningless by legal technicalities. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the county, and Marcus wondered if this was how martyrs felt in their final moments, certain of their righteousness, but uncertain whether their sacrifice would accomplish anything beyond their own destruction. Duke slept on, dreaming perhaps of better days ahead, unaware that his salvation might have doomed them both. The deputy sheriff's cruiser pulled into Marcus's driveway at 7:43 p.m., its headlights cutting through the rain like accusatory fingers pointing toward the farmhouse where two fugitives waited for justice to render its verdict. Deputy Michael Chen emerged from the vehicle with the reluctant posture of someone executing orders he didn't particularly believe in, his uniform darkened by rain that seemed determined to wash the county clean of its accumulated sins. Marcus met him on the front porch, Duke standing beside him with the alert attention of a dog who'd learned to read human tensions for survival cues. The big German shepherd didn't cower or retreat. Instead, he positioned himself protectively between Marcus and the approaching authority figure, his body language suggesting someone prepared to defend what he'd finally found worth protecting. "Evening, Marcus," Deputy Chen said, removing his hat in a gesture that suggested respect rather than protocol. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "Commissioner Phillips sent you to arrest me and retrieve county property," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the calm resignation of someone who'd made peace with consequences. "Though I'm not sure which order you're supposed to execute first." Chen's laugh held no humor, only the bitter recognition of someone caught between competing loyalties. At 35, he'd known Marcus longer than he'd been wearing a badge. The older man had coached his little league team, attended his high school graduation, and written a recommendation letter for the police academy that had launched his career in law enforcement. "Funny thing about Commissioner Phillips," Chen said, wiping rain from his face with the back of his hand. "She seems to think county property can be stolen after it's officially dead. According to the paperwork she filed, Duke was euthanized at 4:30 this afternoon." Hard to steal something that doesn't exist. Marcus felt something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but a loosening of the knot of despair that had tightened around his heart like barbed wire. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I'm saying that if a dog is officially dead, then what I see here must be a different animal. Maybe a stray that wandered onto your property during the storm. Happens all the time in weather like this." Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but his eyes held the warmth of someone who'd decided to interpret his orders creatively. "Of course, if you found a stray, you'd want to get him checked by a veterinarian, make sure he's healthy, up to date on vaccinations. Might take a few days to arrange proper care." The deputy's radio crackled to life, Commissioner Phillips's voice cutting through the static with bureaucratic urgency. "Unit 7, what's your status? Have you secured the stolen animal?" Chen lifted the radio with deliberate slowness, his thumb hovering over the transmit button like someone weighing the consequences of truth versus convenience. "Unit 7 to dispatch, responding to report of theft at 1247 County Road 15. No stolen property located. Property owner reports stray animal on premises. Will file appropriate paperwork regarding animal control issues." The silence that followed felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane, temporary peace surrounded by the promise of renewed chaos. Marcus could imagine Phillips in her county office, surrounded by political advisors who understood that public relations disasters could end careers faster than budget shortfalls or corruption scandals. "Copy that, Unit 7. Return to patrol." Chen clipped the radio back to his belt and looked at Marcus with the expression of someone who'd just burned a bridge he might need to cross again someday. "Like I said, might take a few days to sort out the proper procedures for a stray animal, maybe a week, long enough for, say, adoption paperwork to get processed through normal channels." As the deputy's cruiser disappeared into the rain-soaked night, Marcus felt the weight of unexpected allies in a battle he'd assumed he was fighting alone. Duke pressed against his leg with the solid warmth of someone who'd finally found something worth trusting, and Marcus realized that salvation sometimes came disguised as small acts of bureaucratic rebellion. His phone rang at 8:15 p.m. Linda Thompson's voice came through the speaker with barely controlled excitement mixed with determination that reminded Marcus of Sarah when she'd decided to renovate their kitchen despite having no construction experience whatsoever. "Mr. Henderson, we heard about the situation from the news. Channel 12 is calling it the Great Dog Rescue, which sounds a bit dramatic, but the important thing is that Duke is safe." Marcus laughed despite everything, the sound surprising him with its genuine warmth. "He's safe for now, Mrs. Thompson, but Commissioner Phillips isn't going to let this stand. She'll find another way to get what she wants." "That's exactly why we're calling." John Thompson's voice joined the conversation, his tone carrying the strategic authority of someone who'd learned to plan operations under pressure. "We've been busy this evening. Our adoption application has been expedited through some contacts we have in county government. Turns out our son Michael's death generated more goodwill than we realized." "What are you saying?" "We're saying that effective immediately, we're Duke's legal guardians. The paperwork was processed as an emergency placement, signed by a county judge who remembers Michael's service. Commissioner Phillips can protest all she wants, but she can't override a judicial order." Marcus felt tears burning behind his eyes. Not the bitter tears of frustration he'd grown accustomed to, but the sweet sting of relief mixed with gratitude for people who understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. "There's more," Linda continued, her voice soft with emotion. "We've been in contact with Bobby Martinez. He wants to contribute to Duke's care, and we think that's appropriate. Not ownership. Duke needs stability more than he needs redemption stories. But Bobby's money can help with medical expenses, training, whatever Duke needs to heal properly." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, rain shifting from torrential downpour to steady precipitation that suggested cleansing rather than destruction. Marcus watched Duke explore the living room with increasing confidence, his tail wagging as he discovered toys that had belonged to Max but somehow seemed destined for their new owner. "When can you take him?" Marcus asked, though the question felt like preparing to amputate a limb he'd grown unexpectedly attached to. "Tomorrow morning, if that works for you. We want to give him time to adjust gradually. Maybe you could visit regularly at first, help with the transition. Dogs form attachments, and Duke clearly loves you." As Marcus ended the call and settled into his recliner with Duke sprawled across his feet like a furry blanket, he realized that sometimes the best endings weren't about single heroes saving the day through dramatic gestures. Sometimes salvation came through communities of people making small choices that accumulated into something larger than any individual sacrifice. Duke's gentle snoring filled the quiet house, and Marcus understood that 847 days of waiting had finally led somewhere worth the journey. 6 months after the great escape from Austin County Animal Shelter, Duke Thompson, he'd earned the surname through love rather than law, stood in the backyard of his forever home, watching John Thompson install a new doghouse that would have made military contractors weep with envy. The structure featured insulation, ventilation, and a small porch where Duke could survey his domain like the guardian he'd always been meant to be. The transformation had been gradual but undeniable. The cowering animal who'd pressed himself against kennel walls had evolved into a confident companion who greeted visitors with cautious dignity rather than paralyzing fear. His coat had regained its lustrous black and tan coloring, no longer dulled by stress and inadequate nutrition. The slight limp remained. Some wounds carried permanent reminders, but it no longer defined his movement through the world. Marcus arrived for his weekly visit at precisely 2 p.m., as he had every Sunday since Duke's adoption. The ritual had become sacred to all involved, Marcus bringing news from the shelter, Duke demonstrating new tricks and recovered confidence, and the Thompsons sharing stories of their son Michael that gradually shifted from grief-stricken remembrance to celebration of a life well lived. "He's gained 12 pounds, Linda reported, settling onto the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea that reminded Marcus of summers from his childhood. Dr. Williams says his muscle tone is the best she's seen in a dog his age. All that swimming therapy you suggested really paid off." The swimming had been Marcus's idea, born from memories of Max's rehabilitation after hip surgery years earlier. The Thompsons had found a veterinary facility with an aquatic therapy program, where Duke learned to trust water again after his trauma had associated submersion with helplessness. Now he swam laps twice weekly, his powerful strokes carrying him through chlorinated redemption that strengthened both body and spirit. John emerged from the garage carrying a manila folder thick with documents, the bureaucratic detritus of Duke's legal journey from condemned prisoner to beloved family member. The adoption had generated enough paperwork to stock a law office, but every signature and stamp represented another layer of protection against future Commissioner Phillips and their administrative convenience. "Bobby called this morning," John said, settling into a lawn chair that creaked under his weight. "He's completed his PTSD treatment program. His therapist thinks he's ready for supervised visits with Duke, if everyone's comfortable with that." The question hung in the air like morning mist, visible but insubstantial, requiring careful navigation by people who understood that healing rarely followed straight lines. Bobby Martinez had spent 6 months working through guilt and shame with professionals who specialized in veteran mental health, but theoretical progress was different from practical application when faced with the living reminder of his failures. Marcus watched Duke chase a tennis ball across the perfectly manicured lawn, his powerful legs eating up distance with the joy of someone who'd learned that running toward something was different from running away. The big dog had nightmares still. Linda reported soft whimpers and phantom leg kicks during deep sleep, but they came less frequently now, displaced by dreams that involved playing rather than surviving. "What does Duke think?" Marcus asked, though he knew the answer from watching the dog's body language around men who carried themselves with military bearing. Duke had learned to distinguish between authority that protected and authority that destroyed. But those lessons had been expensive and weren't easily forgotten. As if summoned by the conversation, Duke trotted over with his tennis ball, dropping it at Marcus's feet with the expectant expression of someone who'd discovered that play was possible when safety was guaranteed. His brown eyes held intelligence that had always been present, but was no longer clouded by constant vigilance against threats that might never materialize. "We think supervised visits might be good for both of them," Linda said carefully. "Bobby needs to see that Duke is thriving. Duke needs to understand that his past doesn't define his future, but it has to be Duke's choice." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Williams's veterinary truck, bringing monthly checkups that had become social visits as much as medical examinations. Pat Williams emerged from the driver's seat carrying her familiar medical bag and the slightly frazzled expression of someone who'd spent the morning dealing with Commissioner Phillips's latest bureaucratic innovations. "How's our celebrity patient?" she asked, kneeling to accept Duke's enthusiastic greeting. The transformation in their relationship had been remarkable, from the terrified animal who'd required sedation for basic examinations to this confident dog who viewed veterinary visits as opportunities for attention and treats. "Thriving," Marcus replied, though the word felt insufficient to describe the complete metamorphosis he'd witnessed. Duke hadn't just recovered his physical health, he'd rediscovered his purpose. The Thompsons had enrolled him in a therapy dog program, where his calm presence and intuitive understanding of human emotions provided comfort to veterans struggling with their own invisible wounds. "Commissioner Phillips sends her regards," Dr. Williams said with barely concealed irony. "She wanted me to remind you that the county's new adoption protocols, which she's calling the Duke Initiative, have increased placement rates by 30%. Apparently, extending the hold period for healthy animals and improving behavioral assessments has revolutionized their success metrics." Marcus laughed, recognizing the political calculation that allowed Phillips to transform her greatest embarrassment into a career-advancing innovation. History would remember her as the forward-thinking administrator who reformed the county's animal welfare system, while footnotes might mention the subordinate who'd forced her hand through insubordination and public pressure. "Politics aside, the changes are helping animals," Dr. Williams continued. "We've had 14 long-term residents find homes in the past 6 months. The extra time for behavioral modification and the new foster program are making all the difference." As afternoon shifted toward evening, the assembled group settled into the comfortable rhythm of people who'd shared enough difficult moments to trust each other with their unguarded thoughts. Duke positioned himself strategically where he could monitor all 4 humans while maintaining physical contact with Marcus, the person who'd chosen to risk everything rather than abandon hope. "I've been thinking about Bobby's request," Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd learned that forgiveness was often more complicated than justice. "Duke deserves to see Bobby healthy and sober. Bobby deserves to see Duke happy and safe. Maybe healing requires witnesses." Linda nodded, understanding the deeper implications of reuniting a man with the living reminder of his darkest moments. "We'll start slowly. Neutral location, short visits, no pressure. Duke sets the pace." The plan they developed over the next hour reflected the careful consideration of people who'd learned that good intentions required strategic implementation. Bobby would begin with visits to the therapy dog training facility, where Duke's work provided context for their reunion. Professional trainers would supervise interactions while Duke maintained the security of his established routine and trusted environment. As Marcus prepared to leave, Duke followed him to the truck with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that goodbyes weren't always permanent. The big dog's tail wagged with moderate enthusiasm, enough to show affection, not enough to suggest anxiety about separation. He'd learned to trust that Sunday visits meant Marcus would return the following week, bringing news from the shelter and stories about other animals who'd found their own versions of salvation. "See you next week, big guy," Marcus said, scratching behind Duke's ears in the spot that always made his left leg twitch with reflexive pleasure. "Keep taking care of your family." Driving home through the Texas countryside that had witnessed Duke's transformation from condemned prisoner to beloved son, Marcus reflected on the strange mathematics of rescue work. For every Duke who found his happy ending, dozens of other animals faced less fortunate conclusions. The work was simultaneously heartbreaking and essential, measuring success in individual lives saved rather than systemic problems solved. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny Rodriguez at the shelter. "New arrival today. German Shepherd mix. Owner surrender. Says he's aggressive. Reminds me of someone else we know. Thought you'd want to see him." Marcus smiled, recognizing the cyclical nature of hope that defined animal rescue. Each success story like Duke's created space for another chance, another animal who might benefit from the lessons learned through 847 days of refusing to give up. The work continued, one dog at a time, one decision at a time, one person choosing to believe that every life held value beyond statistical convenience. Behind him, Duke Thompson settled onto his new porch, surveying his kingdom with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned that home wasn't a place you found, but a place you built through love, patience, and the revolutionary act of refusing to abandon hope when hope seemed impossible. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new animals in need, new battles against bureaucratic indifference. But tonight, at least, one story had found its happy ending. And sometimes that was enough to fuel the fight for all the stories still being written. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from grand gestures, but from ordinary people choosing love over convenience when the world tells them to give up. Marcus Henderson, a 67-year-old veteran, reminds us that our finest moments often arrive disguised as impossible choices between what's easy and what's right. Duke's 847-day journey from condemned prisoner to beloved family member proves that it's never too late for second chances, whether you're giving them or receiving them. The Thompson family discovered that healing their grief over their son's death meant opening their hearts to another soul who needed saving, while Bobby Martinez learned that true courage sometimes means admitting when you're not ready to be the person someone deserves. At 55, 60, or 68, we understand that time is precious and loyalty is rare. Duke's story challenges us to ask, when did we last choose hope over statistics, love over logic, or fight for someone who couldn't fight for themselves? In a world that increasingly treats commitment as convenience, perhaps we need reminders that some promises are worth keeping, some weights are worth enduring, and some love is worth the risk of heartbreak. Questions for reflection. Have you ever had to choose between following rules and following your heart? What Duke in your life might be waiting for someone to believe they're worth saving? Please share your thoughts in the comments below.